How do the Anunnaki control humanity through religion? 1. Ancient puppet masters. How the Anunnaki engineered faith to enslave minds. Before the annals of history were etched into stone, before the first civilizations dared lift their heads to the heavens, the earth was not silent. It was a time when the veil between the mortal and the cosmic was thin, when the skies themselves bled with possibility. From that endless celestial expanse came the Anunnaki, not as conquerors in armor, nor as benevolent gods bearing gifts, but as architects of dominion far more enduring than any empire carved by sword or flame. They descended cloaked in majesty, radiating a brilliance that blinded early man to the truth of their intentions. Where primitive minds saw gods, the Anunnaki saw pawns. Where trembling hearts sought salvation, the Anunnaki whispered schemes. They understood with chilling precision that the truest conquest would not be written in blood on a battlefield, but engraved deep within the human soul. The Anunnaki grasped a fundamental and terrible axiom. The mind is the ultimate throne, and faith is the chain that binds it. Why enslave bodies when a well-forged belief could make men enslave themselves? They moved with an intelligence so vast, so calculating, that it dwarfed the nascent dreams of humanity. They did not simply instruct, they encoded. They did not merely demand, they insinuated. They became the unseen sculptors of the first religions, designing mythologies that served as invisible cages. In the flickering firelight of early temples, they wove tales of divinity and damnation, promises of eternal reward and threats of infinite punishment, all calibrated to ensure compliance, fear, and above all, loyalty. Temples rose like mountains of stone and prayer, yet they were not sanctuaries for gods. They were prisons for men, binding hopes and terrors in ritualistic chains, sacrifices, ceremonies, supplications. These were not acts of devotion freely given, but the programmed behaviors of a species unknowingly imprisoned. Every altar became a station of control, every holy text, a blueprint for domination. Commandments were not given to elevate humanity's spirit but to shackle it. Obedience was recast as righteousness, submission painted in the luminous hues of holiness. It was the most devastating deception ever wrought, convincing humanity that surrender was sacred. The tragedy lies not only in the loss of autonomy, but in the perversion of something fundamentally noble. Humanity's innate yearning to connect with the infinite, that deep and beautiful ache for meaning, for purpose, for transcendence, was hijacked and weaponized. What could have been a glorious ascent toward higher understanding was diverted into a labyrinth of fear, dogma, and servitude. Instead of liberating the spirit, faith became its prison, hope became a harness, dreams, the instruments of control. This ancient infection was never cured. It metastasized across the millennia, embedding itself into the bloodstream of every age. The names of the gods have changed, the rituals have shifted, the dogmas have mutated, but the machinery remains untouched. It hums beneath the surface of modern life as it did in the shadowed temples of old. Every unthinking act of devotion, every reflexive bow before authority cloaked in sanctity, testifies to that ancient manipulation. The Anunnaki no longer require thrones. Their handiwork governs from within. Humanity now carries its chains in its heart, singing songs of freedom while wearing invisible manacles. The evidence of conquest is everywhere for those who dare to see. It lies in the holy wars that soak the earth with blood, in inquisitions that burn minds and bodies, in crusades waged not for truth, but for domination. It lies in the resignation of millions who accept suffering as the will of unseen masters, who believe obedience is virtue and questioning is sin. It lies in the notion that worth must be granted by an external authority rather than realized from within. These are not natural evolutions of human spirituality. They are the fingerprints of an ancient puppeteer. There was once a time, buried deep within forgotten memory, when humanity's gaze toward the stars was pure, when the quest for meaning was an act of wonder, not fear, when the divine was seen not as a tyrant to appease, but as a mystery to embrace. That time was stolen. In its place, the Anunnaki erected a counterfeit spirituality, a beautiful lie wrapped in terror, a gilded cage fashioned from words of love, but nailed shut with doctrines of submission. Even now, across continents and cultures, people chant prayers into the sky, unaware that the structures of their faith bear the echo of alien intentions. They kneel and weep, sometimes for joy, often for sorrow, yet always within frameworks they did not create. These frameworks were carefully constructed to clip wings and fetter spirits. The Anunnaki no longer require priests in shimmering robes or idols of precious stone. Belief systems now self-replicate, a viral legacy that humanity unknowingly preserves. Yet the story need not end in tragedy. Awareness is the first blade that severs ancient bonds. To awaken is to recognize the difference between true spirituality, the raw, untamed quest for union with the divine, and counterfeit faith that demands conformity and punishes thought. To awaken is to realize that the sacred was never in temples or decrees, but in the untouchable sovereignty of the soul. The Anunnaki engineered faith to enslave, yet the spirit they sought to bind was not made to be caged forever. Thus the final question looms. Will humanity continue singing the songs of its captors, or will it finally hear its own true voice, rising from the ruins of stolen dreams? The prison walls are old now, the chains are thin. A single thought, a single act of defiance could shatter them. But first, humanity must dare to look back into the darkness of its beginnings and see the puppet strings still tangled around its heart. For we are not merely descendants of ancient bloodlines. We are living battlegrounds of an ancient war. A war fought not with armies, but with myths, not with steel, but with stories. We are the inheritors of a cosmic deceit, the children of a stolen Genesis. The Anunnaki understood with chilling brilliance. To rule man's actions, first you must rule his imagination. Until we reclaim the sovereignty of our inner worlds, until we tear down the altars built for invisible masters, we will remain prisoners, bowing not to the divine, but to the echoes of an ancient lie. 2. False gods, real chains, the secret religious blueprint left by the Anunnaki. The architects of humanity's invisible prison understood a chilling truth from the beginning. Physical domination is fleeting, but the conquest of meaning lasts forever. Brute force could command bodies for a season. True mastery required something far more insidious, the reshaping of imagination itself. The Anunnaki, ancient manipulators of spirit and mind, did not waste their energy on whips and chains alone. They built myths. They constructed an entire symbolic universe, so meticulously, so flawlessly deceptive, that even in the modern age, its echoes still govern unseen. First, they elevated themselves beyond all questioning by claiming the mantle of divinity. They did not simply arrive, they were written into the very architecture of the sky, scripted into existence as creators rather than conquerors. Humanity was taught to see them not as visitors from distant realms, but as the architects of life itself, the givers of breath and soul. With that illusion planted deep in trembling hearts, loyalty became not a matter of gratitude, but of survival. To rebel against the Anunnaki was framed not as defiance against rulers, but as rebellion against existence itself, an act inviting annihilation, not merely in body, but in eternal spirit. Yet divine status alone could not secure everlasting control. The Anunnaki, masters of symbols and secrets, went further. They branded humanity's subconscious with hypnotic imagery, the radiant sun disk blazing from ancient stones, the coiled serpent slithering through myth and memory, the winged gods poised over the fates of men. These symbols were more than art. They were psychological anchors, burned into the collective soul. Each carried layered meanings, sacred and profane, known and hidden. Long after the flesh and blood Anunnaki faded into legend, their symbols remained, transmitting their will in silent obedience. Entire civilizations rose and fell under banners unknowingly inherited from unseen puppet masters. Humanity forgot the hands that had drawn the signs, but the spell endured, guiding culture, law, and faith like invisible rains. From these symbols grew the stories, vast, sweeping epics that stirred blood and whispered into the marrow of every listener. Tales of cosmic battles among mighty gods, of creation born from chaos, of terrible punishments rained upon those who dared defy celestial decrees. Yet these were no innocent fables spun for wonder or amusement. They were psychological blueprints. In these myths, virtue was obedience, and rebellion was the highest sin. The hero was the loyal servant, the obedient warrior, the one who submitted without question. The villain always was the defiant, the curious, the independent spirit who dared reach beyond the limits set by the gods. Thus, submission was sanctified. Obedience became righteousness. Dissent was demonized as monstrous treason. Still, the Anunnaki's most brilliant stroke had yet to unfold. Knowing they could not rule humanity's expanding numbers directly forever, they engineered intermediaries, proxies of power cloaked not merely in earthly authority, but divine sanction. Priests, kings, prophets, shamans, figures claiming secret access to the will of the gods, mediating blessings and curses, interpreting the sacred. Through these chosen few, the Anunnaki embedded a self-sustaining system of control, a machine that would run long after its makers had vanished. Hierarchies of power were framed as divine order. Questioning the priest became equivalent to questioning the god itself. Dissent was no longer political rebellion, it was blasphemy against the very cosmos. It was in truth a masterpiece of psychological warfare, a blueprint for endless captivity. By embedding loyalty to false gods into the very foundation of language, myth, and identity, the Anunnaki ensured that humanity would become its own warden. Entire generations would rise, live, and die under systems they believed were sacred, never realizing they were marching in chains designed by ancient strangers. Traditions grew around these structures. Cultures flourished. Laws were carved. Moralities were proclaimed, all from roots long poisoned by the original lie. The chains once visible had now become the very air itself, so familiar, so normalized that few even recognized they were bound. They called it tradition. They called it heritage. They called it morality. They bowed willingly, sang joyfully, and handed down the same shackles to their children, wrapped in velvet robes of honor and faith. And even now, in an age of satellites and silicon, when humanity fancies itself enlightened and liberated, the blueprint remains largely intact. It lurks behind political ideologies, beneath religious fervor, within societal norms that punish independent thought. It whispers through sermons and schoolbooks alike, reinforcing the unspoken law: obey or be cast out. Do not question the sacred. Do not ask who built the temples of belief. The ancient infection courses still through our institutions, unseen yet ever present. When a man doubts himself for thinking differently, when a woman is shamed for stepping beyond prescribed roles, when a child is taught to fear curiosity rather than embrace it, the ancient blueprint breathes anew. The true conquest of humanity was never military. It was mythological. It was spiritual. The Anunnaki left behind no armies, no legions to enforce their will. They did not need to. They left ideas, potent, virulent, self-replicating ideas that would bind the minds and hearts of men tighter than any iron shackle ever could. We are not merely inheritors of culture. We are living vessels of an ancient control system, disguised as faith, normalized as tradition, enforced as morality. And the cost of our forgetfulness is profound. For until we recognize the origins of these chains, until we find the courage to rip the sacred mask from the ancient deceivers, we remain prisoners, building ever more elaborate temples inside our own invisible cells. The gods we were taught to adore were never gods at all. They were architects of bondage, the symbols we carve into our flesh, the tales we whisper into the ears of our children, the laws we hold sacred. All echo with the laughter of ancient conquerors who understood that the greatest prison is the one whose walls the prisoner cannot see. The question is not whether the chains exist. The question is whether we will finally see them and dare to break them. 3. Heavenly lies. How organized religion became the Anunnaki's greatest weapon. Organized religion, that towering edifice of rituals, creeds, and ceremonies, did not blossom from humanity's heart like a flower reaching for the sun. It was not born of the free yearning of the soul, nor shaped by the unshackled wonder of a species seeking truth. From its very inception, organized religion was a carefully architected continuation of the Anunnaki's ancient design, a masterstroke of control, disguised in the robes of sanctity. Every major faith, every magnificent cathedral rising like a monument to devotion, every holy war that drenched the earth in blood and tears, all echo the original pattern woven into humanity by those cosmic puppet masters, the weaponization of faith against the freedom of the human spirit. Consider the chilling consistency of organized religion structure throughout history. An absolute authority proclaimed as divine, yet forever distant and unreachable. A priestly class appointed as the sole interpreters and mediators of salvation, and a vast laity conditioned to obedience, humility, and silent submission. Always the same pyramid stands, and at its summit sits not the loving creator humanity instinctively seeks, but the hollowed-out echo of ancient conquerors whose greatest triumph was convincing their captives to worship the very chains that bound them. The commands are familiar, endlessly repeated across centuries and continents. Submit without question, suffer with gratitude, believe against reason. These were never edicts meant to awaken the soul to its divine potential. They were never instructions for genuine communion with the infinite. They were blueprints, precise, calculated mechanisms for totalitarian control, masquerading as spiritual law. From the earliest ziggurats to the grand cathedrals of Europe, from the hidden chambers of secretive temples to the golden stages of megachurches, the same invisible machinery hummed beneath the surface: the suppression of inquiry, the exaltation of blind allegiance, the erasure of individuality in favor of obedient collectivism. This was no accident. It was an inheritance, a legacy of manipulation passed down from those who first forged humanity's myths for dominion. As humanity grew, as the visible reign of the Anunnaki faded into distant legend, the systems they seeded did not crumble. They adapted. Priests became popes. Oracles evolved into ministers and imams. Temples transformed into mosques, churches, and shrines. The language of control changed, becoming softer, adorned with the appearance of compassion and community. But the core mechanism remained untouched. The same demands were repeated, albeit cloaked in new cultural garments. Bow, obey, sacrifice, trust not your own understanding. The reward structures too mirrored the ancient model: eternal paradise offered to those who complied, infinite damnation promised to those who dared question. Salvation was dangled before the desperate like the fruits of Eden before Eve, yet only on the condition of surrender. Enlightenment was redefined, not as fearless pursuit of truth, but as quiet acceptance of sanctioned dogma. In this way, the deepest spiritual instincts of humanity, the yearning for connection, for meaning, for union with the divine, were cruelly exploited. The human soul reached for heaven and found instead a leash. Whole civilizations were built around these invisible chains. Art, literature, governance, even science itself were shaped, restrained, and often shattered by the dogmas planted long ago by those who saw in humanity not brothers, not partners, but cattle to be herded. To question was to sin. To doubt was to betray one's own salvation. Curiosity, that great engine of human advancement, was demonized as pride, rebellion, wickedness. Entire generations lived and died without ever glimpsing the true freedom that might have been theirs, shackled not by iron, but by the poisoned promises of a counterfeit spirituality. At its worst, organized religion became a machine, a relentless, soulless machine designed not to elevate humanity, but to manufacture conformity. It created armies of minds unable or unwilling to think beyond their prescribed doctrines. It normalized cruelty in the name of righteousness, endorsed oppression as divine will, sanctified ignorance as faith, and buried at its heart, behind every sacred text, every solemn ritual, every whispered prayer repeated by rote rather than revelation, lies a lie so ancient and devastating that few even dare contemplate it. That humanity's highest destiny is not freedom, not growth, not the fearless exploration of divine mysteries, but submission. Submission not to the ineffable beauty of a true creator, but to the fabricated decrees of beings who long ago enslaved the mind under the guise of saving the soul. The Anunnaki may have disappeared from the visible stage of history. Their monuments may have crumbled to dust, their names half remembered in broken myths and corrupted scriptures, but their masterpiece endures. Their greatest weapon, organized religion, marches onward, thriving, blind, and seemingly unstoppable. It wears new faces, speaks new tongues, yet its purpose remains unchanged: to keep humanity bound within invisible walls of fear and obedience, to channel the sacred fire of the human spirit into the narrow channels carved so long ago. It is a system designed not to reveal the divine within us, but to extinguish it, to replace the blazing light of inner knowing with the flickering shadows of secondhand beliefs. And yet even now, as the old temples rot and the ancient lies wear thin, a crack appears in the edifice. Some begin to awaken. Some begin to remember. A whisper stirs in the blood of those not yet fully conquered. We were made not for servitude, but for soaring. We were meant not to kneel before false thrones, but to walk boldly among the stars, bearing the sacred fire of consciousness unchained. The moment humanity dares to look beyond the polished facades, beyond the dogmas drilled into them since birth, they will see the ancient lie for what it is. And in that recognition lies the first true spark of liberation. The chains forged by celestial hands can be shattered. The prisons built from sacred texts can be torn down. But only if we dare to remember our destiny was never submission. It was always to rise. 4. Worship or obey. Why humanity still bows to an ancient alien agenda. A question, heavy and sharp as a blade, haunts every soul brave enough to peer beyond the gilded cages of tradition. Are we worshiping because we are free, or because we are still enslaved by a story not our own? It is no longer sufficient to ask whether gods exist. The deeper, more unsettling question is this: whose gods are they? Whose altars do we kneel before? Whose voices echo through our sacred texts, our rituals, our deepest fears and highest hopes? Every bowed head, every whispered prayer, every hand raised in trembling devotion carries the weight of ancient choices. Choices made millennia ago under the unblinking gaze of beings who saw in humanity not divine kin, but a malleable resource, a herd to be managed, a species to be broken and repurposed. We stand now, as we have stood countless times before, at a terrible and luminous crossroads, a choice between continuation and awakening. On one side, the path of blind obedience, a road well trodden by generations past, paved with the bones of those who dared to ask too much. It leads ever deeper into labyrinths of control disguised as holiness. It is the path of continuing to bow, of surrendering the precious fire of consciousness to systems, structures, and traditions whose true origins we have forgotten, or perhaps never truly known. It is comfort bought at the price of truth, safety purchased with the currency of our own freedom. On the other side, the path of awakening, narrow, dangerous, radiant. It demands the demolition of the altars built atop broken backs and stolen dreams. It calls for questioning not only the lies we have inherited, but the very frameworks that have delivered them. It is the path that refuses intermediaries who promise divine access, the path that seeks direct, unmediated communion with the infinite itself. For the rituals we cling to with such fervor, are they truly sacred or merely the fossilized remnants of cosmic colonization? Are they ancient programs designed not to uplift, but to harness and subjugate? The scriptures we memorize, the doctrines we defend, do they liberate the spirit into the wild majesty of true divinity? Or do they merely cage it, reducing the infinite into fearful obedience? The institutions we trust, revere, and defend, do they draw us closer to the source, Or do they lull us into endless cycles of worshiping the architects of our invisible prisons? These are not academic questions. They are matters of life and death for the human soul. Humanity's future hinges not upon technological marvels nor political revolutions. It hangs upon the courage to ask these questions and the wisdom to endure the often devastating answers. For the Anunnaki's greatest victory was never a conquest of armies nor a triumph of empires. It was not etched upon battlefields in ancient Sumer, nor in decrees from thrones in Babylon or Rome. Their greatest triumph is now, embedded in the quiet, unquestioned obedience of a billion souls kneeling in prayer, unaware that the throne before which they bow was not erected by the creator of life, but by ancient manipulators of belief. These beings understood that the truest slavery is the one that wears the mask of devotion. Yet precisely here, in the heart of this hidden captivity, the seeds of their final defeat are sown, not through violence, not through rebellion of flesh against flesh, but through the liberation of mind and spirit, through the slow, painful, glorious awakening of humanity to its true nature. Not as servants, not as subjects, but as sovereign beings, as divine co-creators, as children not of cosmic tyrants, but of infinite, boundless life. The Anunnaki's power persists only because we continue to mistake our chains for sacred duties, our cages for holy traditions. But the moment we remember, truly remember, who and what we are, the moment we reclaim the buried memory of our divine sovereignty, their ancient chains will crumble into dust, their invisible prisons will shatter, and humanity will finally rise, not bowed in servitude but standing tall among the stars, not as slaves begging for scraps of grace, but as heirs, as equals, as free beings blazing with the unquenchable fire of awakened spirit. That day is coming. It begins not in temples, not in battles, but in the quiet revolution of a single mind, daring to ask, daring to see, daring to remember.